Welcome to the Compact Podcast. I'm Geoff Shullenberger in for Matthew Schmitz this week, and I'm joined by Sohrab, Ahmari, and Nina Power. Today we will be discussing Trump's trouncing of his rivals in the first primary in Iowa, Iran's escalatory actions in the Middle East, and the ongoing saga of Bill Ackman, hedge fund manager and extremely prolific tweeter, and the center of strange parallel plagiarism scandals rocking the internet for weeks on end. So, to start off, Sohrab, you wrote a brief piece for us on the results of the Iowa caucus, the first primary in the cycle of Republican primaries that will be determining the nominee. Trump got more than 50% of the vote, followed by Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley in that order. Somewhat disappointing result for Haley. Surprisingly okay result for DeSantis, despite his what is generally regarded to have been a quite terrible campaign. So nonetheless, none of this seems to have really changed the reality that Trump is way far ahead of his rivals. So Sohrab, could you summarize your piece and just kind of give your impressions of where the race stands after this first primary?
Yeah, sure. So the piece I wrote is Left Behind, America Sticks with Trump. And it's based on a data point from Nate Cohn, who covers politics for the New York Times and is number cruncher type journalist, a data journalist, although not exclusively. Anyway, Nate Cohn pointed out that in the early results in districts where a majority of residents have a college degree, Nikki Haley, the kind of establishment GOP favorite, thumped Donald Trump. By contrast, in districts where most of the residents don't have a college degree, she barely managed to get 10%. And so the lesson there is left behind America. You're at least you could say more downscale or more left behind Republicans continue to form a base around Donald Trump. They are continuing to drive the party quite against the wishes of its establishment in a more populist direction represented by Trump. Now, as you know, Geoff and Nina, given my work, I mean, I've critiqued the extent to which Trumpian populism is genuinely populist, or whether or not Trump managed to actually bring about the kinds of promises he made in 2015-16. Nevertheless, every 4 years, it seems, 2016, 2020, and now heading into the 2024 election cycle, there's a kind of core working class and small town base that sees Trump as their political salvation, as their voice, and that's not shifting. He's consolidated that. In 2020, he actually expanded it beyond to working class people of color, giving rise to the expression the multiracial working class, and I would suspect that he's going to continue to do that in 2024. That doesn't necessarily mean he's poised to win the election. He struggles with suburban women. He struggles with, educated whites. He's core elements of the Democratic Rainbow Coalition will probably stay with President Biden, notwithstanding their distaste for his policy on Gaza. But, as far as the story of the Republican Party's base transformation is in itself interesting. And I think that's what I focused on. What it means for the establishment party is just that they have to grit and bear it. It's kind of funny to watch them have to deal with it. They're going to like the stages of grief. For example, I saw lots of tweets from National Review types that night saying, the networks and the newspapers announced the results too early, while people were still voting. And this shows that they are really secretly in the tank for Trump because they see him as an easier opponent for President Biden. And that's why they're promoting Trump. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous. They're doing everything they can to stop the Trump. I don't know what they're talking about. Or, basically kind of the Wall Street Journal editorial page and others tisking that the Republican base is delivering the party to an erratic person, someone who's facing prosecutions and convictions, when in fact, I think it's not in spite of those facts, but because of those facts that a certain portion of the base is rallying to Trump. And the lesson for liberals is, I think, what Sam Moyn, the Yale law school scholar and author, argued in our pages when the Colorado Supreme Court said that Trump would be removed from ballots in that state for 2024. And namely that if you want to address this discontent that drives people to embrace Trump, the way to do it is not through sort of lawfare, through prosecution, browbeating, high-handed dismissal of the electorate, but rather trying to listen to what their what the source of their discontent is and trying to address it with a positive vision. So the answer is more, not less democracy.
Yeah, I guess just a couple of words on this. I mean, I think we've argued all along in different pieces that we have to understand Trump's popularity, even when he didn't kind of follow through on various policies. And there's lots of discussion about cult of personality, which I think is a bit dismissive. I think there's much more going on. Whatever Trump does, whether he'll be running for president from prison, which would just be the most cinematic American thing ever. I don't think we'll get to that point, but it's a visual and psychedelic possibility. But I think Trump remains somebody who is not first and foremost a politician. And I think this is the problem that a lot of politicians have, which is most people don't want to think about politicians and politics particularly much. They see Trump as a businessman, and as Matthew Schmitz, our colleague, argued recently in the New York Times, also as someone who's actually a moderate on many issues. Like we know, for example, in terms of diplomacy, he was actually quite good in many cases, precisely because he was, even in relation to North Korea, we're publishing about North Korea today, there's something of that kind of wanting to get on with business. And I think people relate to that too. They understand him as a middle-class businessman. Of course, he's not middle class at all, but he has this affect. I think in the heartlands, of course, it makes sense that people would like someone who represents their interests, who would defend the working man, who would protect an image of America. And whether Trump actually does that or is irrelevant to the almost like the magic he creates. And when I say magic, I don't mean this that people are being bewildered. I think that charisma and these politically extraneous things are actually central to politics. And nobody understands politics at all if they can't explain why Trump remains popular. And this is what we have to understand. And I think we've done a good job in terms of covering these different aspects, including a very interesting piece recently about perhaps people identify with Trump precisely in his being prosecuted. That the experience of many Americans is actually of being at odds with the state in one form or another, or feeling cheated or and so on. And I think, all of these multiple forms of identity absolutely need to be understood.
Like there's a sense in which there was and is the symbiosis between, outlets like CNN, New York Times, et cetera, and Trump, in that he was very good for business for them, right? CNN CEO has said as much. He really kind of helped the liberal media. And so, he's just in purely bottom line terms, like they're clearly not for him ideologically, but it's helpful and aren't even, probably in some ways would prefer for him not to be the nominee, but just having him around is a good way of driving traffic. So, but, the thing that they seized on recently was this phrase about immigrants poisoning the blood of our country. I can't find the exact, the full statement that was part of at the moment, but this was the phrase that was seized on, and it's compared to a phrase in Mein Kampf. It's clear that Trump's appeal is once again in part driven by his willingness to talk openly about immigration as a problem at a moment when the border crisis is quite severe. And, in New York, there's been an enormous influx of migrants over the past year, which has, really strained resources. And a lot of people in New York who wouldn't vote for Trump almost certainly are nevertheless quite angry about this and, giving the mayor very low ratings because of it. And it's clear that the Democrats don't really have an answer to this and don't really have anything meaningful to say about it. And so, I think probably just the fact that he's talking about it and making it central, even if he's doing so and using language that is kind of strange and unpleasant sounding, is probably a net benefit. And then, the irony of this is that its phrase has brought back this kind of ever current idea that some kind of, blood and soil fascist candidate. But, the irony of this now is that, as Sohrab mentioned, he's actually, part of his strength is that he's increased his base of support, particularly among Latino voters, but also among Black voters. And not only that, but part of Biden's weakness going into the election is that there are quite a number of Black and minority voters who seem poised to stay home, even if they don't actually pull the lever for Trump. They're sort of not invested enough in keeping Biden in office, and they to actually go and sort of make a vote just against Trump. So in other words, the point is that, regardless of what we might think of this exact language, my own sense is, I think he's, it's ugly. It is kind of ugly and unpleasant, but nonetheless, I think the majority of people probably don't see it as a deal breaker, right? They just think, that they've accepted that he's somebody who, is not particularly tight in his messaging and just kind of speaks off the cuff and shoots from the hip. And that's just something they've already accepted about him. So they're not as sort of swayed by these turns of phrase, these kind of ugly turns of phrase as elite media outlets want them to be. That's kind of my impression. So, again, the irony here is that this is coming at precisely the moment when, the people who are supposed to be most offended by this seem to be even more, likely to vote for, or at least not vote against Donald Trump than ever before. Minority voters, working class minority voters, are often very likely to be, more concerned about the current massive influx of migrants than the sort of, upper middle class white New York Times, sort of archetypal New York Times reader is, because they do see, services they rely on being strained, and they see also, competition for, service jobs from people who are willing to work for less. And so that's kind of an irony of the current situation as I would see it.
Yeah, just want to echo your point, I guess, the way in which the conversation about immigration just stops at Trump's weird rhetoric, right? And not the underlying issue. I think this is a persistent weakness for Democrats and their media allies, the fact that for the most part, there are exceptions to this, but for the most part, the underlying problem, which, as you said, has Democratic mayors like Mayor Adams here in New York City and elsewhere, they are like at their wits' end in terms of how to deal with this problem. I think a certain kind of liberal just does language policing. Now, if that language policing were married to like better immigration policy, a recognition that we do have a broken border and there's unseemly numbers of people coming across without sufficient kind of medical checks, without background checks, with no sense of like the pressure that they put on public services, not just in the frontline border states, but increasingly in places further up north. That's the underlying problem. And so, you can be mad about Trump's rhetoric, but if you don't address the issues, people will take you less and less seriously. And they wonder like, well, maybe Trump has a point. This is a huge failure of the entire kind of bipartisan establishment, the way we can't talk about the underlying issues, but especially of the liberal left, that they just stick to language policing. It's a strategy they've been doing they've been deploying for a long time. And it's really, I think, wearing thin.
So moving to the Middle East, scene of unrest and conflict in recent months, obviously focused on the war in Gaza generally. The Red Sea and Yemen have become significant conflict zone, as we discussed last week. And now we've seen a sort of escalation around the borders of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Turning to our Iran expert, Sohrab Ahmari. When I first saw this announcement that there had been a sort of Iranian missile attack on an area near the U.S. consulate in Erbil in northern Iraq, probably pronouncing that wrong, which is in the Kurdish region of Iraq. This seemed quite, and initially it was reported that the consulate itself had been hit. this seemed, highly escalatory. At the time, you told me, well, this actually isn't all that unusual. These kind of things have happened before. We've seen Iran launch missiles, claiming that it's launching them against terrorist groups. We had this strange incident, bombs explode within Iran, during this memorial event for Qasem Soleimani. And it seems to be, and this was blamed on, and ISIS took responsibility for this. And so Iran is now saying it's hitting these kind of terrorist and intelligence centers of its enemies. So I think people have found this quite alarming. It's also hit targets within Pakistan. People like myself have been alarmed by this, concerned that some sort of hot war with Iran might be taking shape. So what's your impression of what's going on, Sohrab?
Yeah, I guess I'm still maintaining a broad equanimity on this because of the history of Iran doing this, precisely targeting the U.S. consulate in Erbil in the Kurdish autonomous region of Iraq. These types of kind of flashpoints always seem somewhat staged to me. I mean, I'm not saying they literally pick up the phone and give a heads up, but they always make a point of not doing too much damage to the consulate building and what have you. So, I mean, I think this is a kind of warning from Iran that it's unhappy about something, and that's how it communicates it with these ballistic missiles. And so, on the whole, it seems to me that we're still not on a trajectory of full-scale regional war, and may it always remain that way. That said, someone like Jonathan Schanzer at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies is definitely a hawk, but he's a very sort of astute and serious analyst. Recently posted a tweet thread in which he predicted that we are heading that way, specifically not with, let's say, the Houthis or direct Iranian involvement, but the fuller opening up of Israel's northern front with Hezbollah in Lebanon, that's underway. And if you follow these kind of Lebanese militant groups and their social media platforms, they certainly seem like they're gearing up for something. But that said, I don't know why Iran would change its calculus about Gaza, which is namely this, that they're not going to waste Lebanese arsenal on Gaza. That's what they've shown so far, for the most part. Not that there haven't been rockets lobbed here and there, operations cross-border. They're not going to unleash the full thing that they have, because that's Iran's first line of defense. As they see it, it's their defense outside Iran's borders. So why would they waste it on Gaza, as horrific as the situation there has been for civilians? So I continue to be fairly calm about the prospect of a bigger war, introducing this dissenting note against myself that there are serious analysts who think some sort of bigger war, maybe involving Lebanon, is on the horizon.
This attack on Iranian soil for the Soleimani memorial was very extreme. I mean, this is a very serious attack, assuming that it really was IS. It's not, the motives for this are a bit unclear, I think. I'm not sure it's completely understood, unless you have greater insight. And I mean, you can sort of see the point of a country trying to say to its neighbors, who may or may not be harboring people who supported that action, back off. And I mean, I visited Iran a couple of times about 20 years ago. It's a very proud country. Obviously it's Shia in a sunny region. It's very, I want to say hermetic. It's not quite the right word, but it's very, very of itself. And I think would not be averse to making it clear that it would up the ante. Again, I'm not saying that means that there's going to be some kind of catastrophe. Again, this is a way of thinking that people have been engaged in for a long time, including speculation about America going to war with Iran. This is, I was thinking the other day about the axis of evil. If you recall this 2002 phrase that was used that included Iran and North Korea and Iraq and so on. All countries where the 9/11 bombers were not from. But in any case, it's always sort of on the horizon. And I mean, it's true that the border of South Lebanon, which I've also visited, is extremely close to Israel. It's really shocking how close Lebanon is to Israel. It's there's a little valley. And then, when you have your mobile phone, you can pick up the Israeli providers. I think people are very aware that any escalation will be extremely devastating, as it already has been for Lebanon in the past in terms of Israeli bombings. I can understand Iran not wanting to get involved, even though they might ostensibly politically support Gaza against Israel. I think hopefully this is about avoiding conflagration or anything worse, but I can see also that it's unsettled. The situation is unsettled.
I mean, something I've been trying to work out in my head without claiming great expertise on the region is, unlike Hamas, Hezbollah is more equivalent to a kind of state actor, which I think gives it different incentives than Hamas. Hamas clearly never ceased to sort of see itself as fundamentally a kind of insurgency, and the revelation of these tunnel networks, which are quite fascinating and incredible. I mean, I've seen people joke that like they should bring Hamas to, build new subway lines in New York City, capable of kind of building these incredibly sophisticated tunnel networks over the past 15 years. What you see there is they're investing in a kind of infrastructure that is, not that of a state, but that of a sort of terrorist insurgency. And that's what they were putting their money into, not into sort of providing meaningful services for people or building kind of state-like infrastructure. So, I mean, I think that's revealing, Hezbollah is clearly an insurgency, but I think it's sort of part of the power sharing agreement in Lebanon that the U.S. has, essentially given its blessing to. So it's weirdly the case that Hezbollah is not, it's not entirely outside of the U.S. sort of sphere of influence, right? Because the U.S. has a set of arrangements with Lebanon, and because Hezbollah is part of the power sharing agreement within Lebanon, that means it's in a way a kind of it's not only an Iran proxy, it's also kind of part of the U.S. Kind of global power network. But something that. And so I think that sort of makes sense that if you're essentially functioning as a state, you have an incentive to like not do things that are going to bring about like the catastrophic destruction of your entire sort of infrastructure, which is what would likely occur. I think we saw some Israeli official at some point say like, look at what's happening to Gaza. We can do that to Beirut. We've done it before, which they have, right? Beirut was kind of completely laid waste to. In previous wars in ways that resemble the current situation in Gaza. So, I think in Lebanon, they're sort of aware of that. And, and I think the Hezbollah leadership is savvy about these things in certain respects. Probably much more the kind of decisive question is what happens there and how it plays out. We shall see. I think one other thing to throw in the mix here is just to say, I do think, what we're seeing as our columnist Malcolm Chiuna has argued repeatedly is, this kind of weakening of U.S. deterrence, right? Our ability to kind of deter the emergence of conflicts in various places seems to be weakening. And so Iran lobbing some missiles at supposed enemies within Pakistan is a pretty good example of this. So the question is, can the Biden administration find some way of reestablishing some greater deterrence? Or if Trump is able to win in November, is he able to significantly shift foreign policy in such a way that reestablishes some kind of deterrence? I think that's probably the big question. Reestablishing a deterrent will really require a massive investment in U.S. military. Infrastructure and industrial, the military industrial base. That's all remains to be seen. So moving on to a lighter subject, not entirely unrelated, because it's been the weird kind of culture war fallout of the events in the Middle East has, centered around the activities of the hedge fund billionaire Bill Ackman. So this saga has been ongoing for months at this point. But, particularly over the past month or so, he's really become a sort of perpetual main character and has made himself that partly through writing these, really interminable tweets, document the ongoing saga that he's been embroiled in, or that he's embroiled himself in. he was one of the sort of major Harvard donors who, after the October 7th attack, was very upset by the pro-Palestinian demonstrations on Harvard's campus and the statements of some of its staff and faculty, seeming to condone, or at least, not condemn strongly enough the Hamas's actions. And, this ultimately led him to, sort of spearhead this campaign against Claudine Gay, which was ultimately successful at ousting her, although initially it really had to do with this desire to inflict consequences for refusal to, make strong statements about against Hamas and terrorism. But then it became about this charge of plagiarism, which proven pretty credible and ultimately did lead to her resignation. Which of you would like to summarize sort of the subsequent phases of the saga and how it's become this kind of bizarre soap opera?
I mean, maybe I'll just add a couple of things here. I mean, clearly, so his wife is now involved, this woman, Neri Oxman, who at one point made some kind of globe. She's some sort of strange architectural theorist, but in the very postmodern vein, I guess. Like, if you ever go to art colleges, this is the kind of thing that people will right? It's a sort of poetic kind of verbiage in some cases. Not always terrible, let's be clear. There's some delight to be had, but in any case, is it Business Insider? Some magazine or newspaper I've never heard of has decided to turn the tables, and now everyone's accusing everyone else of plagiarism. And so Bill Ackman's wife is this sort of strange theorist, also sort of very beautiful, has been accused of plagiarism in her PhD. But then it turns out that the Wikipedia entry was also plagiarized from a 1930s book on weaving. I don't know. It's gone completely mental. Bill Ackman has sort of stepped in to defend his wife's honor. He's clearly very much, very, very protective of her. Like he has this kind of heroic quest to protect his beautiful theorist, poetic, architectural wife from the iniquities of the Business Insider. But the whole thing has become like very Ouroboros, like the snake eating its tail, and I tweeted recently about this whole thing about plagiarism is really like to miss the point in many ways. I think actually what academics end up doing is largely self-plagiarizing. Like Geoff and I have been academics, and really most of the pressure on is to keep churning out work. So you end up kind of making the same arguments, even cutting and pasting paragraphs that you've already written into new chapters. And so I think there is something, more serious work here, which is about the influence of billionaires. There's questions of hypocrisy, whether we're really actually doing this because we really care about plagiarism, or whether this is just the current thing to, also in the age of AI and ChatGPT, this is a interesting thing to flare up, like why plagiarism. I think we need to psychoanalyze the current moment. There is the desires of these billionaires and their love for their wives, and whether we actually live in a democracy or just a kind of strange sovereign oligarchy filled with absolutely crazy people. Who knows? This is my take.
It's worth noting he did successfully court her, against a competitor, Brad Pitt, right? So, in other words, she also was dating Brad Pitt, and he managed
did not know that.
Yeah, he managed to win her over with very stiff competition. So, that's kind of fascinating, and perhaps explains part of his great protectiveness. But it's an extremely odd scenario. I mean, another thing that's worth noting here is that it's kind of pitted him now against Business Insider, which is part of Axel Springer. It's part of the Axel Springer media empire, which has itself, is sort of known as, a kind of German language, Rupert Murdoch equivalent. But which has itself been sort of aggressively pro-Israel, and that the CEO Matthias Döpfner is himself kind of has made some and published some very kind of pro-Israel and sort of highly critical of alleged anti-Semitism on the left type statements. So they're actually like quite ideologically aligned And it seems that Ackman thought he could kind of use this to get Döpfner to essentially force one of his properties to rescind the, or retract or, correct the articles or the article alleging his wife's plagiarism. This didn't work out. So now Business Insider and Springer are sort of Ackman's sworn enemies, who he's trying to take down in the way he did Kleidinge. Weirdly, it seems that Döpfner himself has some potential plagiarism or academic malfeasance in his past. All very strange. But one of the themes, it seems to me, here is that of private tyranny, which is the subject of your book. That you basically have, this whole conflict playing out as kind of this very public war between billionaires who are able to kind of shape discourse and drive political discussion, just by dint of the power they've accrued through money, and that, the public sphere is kind of, downstream of these sort of titans of hedge funds and stuff like that. So it seems to me very germane to, the kind of cultural ramifications of the reality you describe in your book.
Yeah, one line I had in an early draft of Tyranny Inc., which it ended up getting cut, is that one of the features of Tyranny Inc., privatized tyranny, is this appearance of furious intra-class battle between billionaires. Now this guy champions the people as a friendly plutocrat, and against that guy who is seen as a villain. And this kind of, you see that on Twitter, where kind of populist-ish figures have lined themselves up with, Elon or Ackman or others, sort of as their hammers against whoever they perceive as their political enemies, but forgetting the degree to which these people are, self-interested. And in Ackman's case, coming from, frankly, like a world of predatory finance, that they're responsible for bringing about the conditions in which we are, in which we find ourselves in the first place. Trust not in billionaires is the bottom line, because they have their own agendas. But there is a new age of billionaire worship of a kind that hadn't been around in the U.S. to a degree that hadn't been around in the U.S. for a long time. There was, in Britain, there was always Richard Branson, who, to his credit, runs a conglomerate that does lots of useful things. It's not like he just made a few Wall Street bets and became a billionaire. But just in general, I see so much of that now. The idea that the billionaire is our refuge from, censorious, for example, PMCs who would otherwise take control of social media networks, and losing sight of the fact that, billionaires have their own whims and that billionaires have their own interests. And, there's nothing in that worldview that bars them or gives them second thoughts about deploying private censorship. So I see that as the most irritating component of this is this, yes, Bill Ackman, our champion. It's no, he's not. He's I was going to use a word that would get our podcast flagged by Apple as a not family friendly podcast. So I'll stop there.
So I think that's a good place to leave it. Thanks, Sohrab. Thanks, Nina. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, please check out Sohrab's postmortem on the Iowa caucus to get access. If you have not, please subscribe. compactmag.com/subscribe. See you next week.